Beetlejuice? 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 I shouldn't say that too many times, but why is it found so many times on seals from Chizkiyahu HaMelech? And besides, speaking of beetles, flies. Why are flies compared to Egypt? And finally, who dug his own grave and never got to get buried in it? Well, welcome to another episode of Sefer Study, Archaeology Snapshot. I'm Nachliel Selavan, and here we are studying another episode. This is Sefer Yeshayahu, and this new image up on top is there for a specific reason, which we're going to get into in just a moment. So what are we doing here in Sefer Study and Archaeology Snapshot? Our goal is basically to cover the four following questions for each Sefer, which is, when is the story happening? Who are the main players? Where exactly are they located? And lots of juicy highlights from history and archaeology. So many people watch videos, enjoy and appreciate and learn from them, but when you hit that like button, which really takes you just a second, it really boosts the algorithms and enables the video to be seen by other people and enjoyed, and it really promotes Tanach Studies channel. So please take a second and hit that like button right now. It just takes a second, and keep in mind to do that whenever you enjoy a video that you see. So speaking of this image that I just chose of a new scroll, which is actually an image of the earliest scroll of Yeshayahu that we have, a complete Sefer Yeshayahu from almost 2,000 years ago, found in the Judean desert as part of a collection of what's known today as the Dead Sea Scrolls, even though it includes quite an interesting range of different scrolls from more or less the end of the Second Temple period, but also the Bar Kokhba Revolt, as well as the Aleppo Codex. Those are all there in the Shrine of the Book, which is the image that you're seeing. Now, the scroll that you are seeing in the center of the Shrine of the Book, which is in the Israel Museum, is intended to look like a scroll, and all around it is a replica of a complete scroll of Sefer Yeshayahu from about 2,000 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, this is incredible and it's fascinating. Now, if you want to explore the scroll without even going to the museum, you can go into the Israel Museum's website, which you can see right here on the screen, and you can actually go into several of the Dead Sea Scrolls. For example, I'm showing you Yeshayahu, and you can scroll through the entire Sefer and zoom in to actually read the words. This is very, very exciting, and I highly encourage you to do this. Of course, this is Second Temple period, but there's always going to be some juicy archaeology highlights that we're going to get into, even if they expand beyond the period of Tanach, because we got to share and you got to know about them. Now let's get into it. Yeshayahu Hanavi. Yeshayahu Hanavi operates in the city of Yerushalayim more or less at the height of Malchut Yisrael. In other words, we are coming out of Yerovam II, who expanded the borders of Malchut Yisrael, and at the same time we have more or less a very powerful, the height of Malchut Yehuda at the time, even though it's going to be powerful again, and that's under Uzziya. And so, as the Sefer opens up, it tells us that Yeshayahu is operating in the times of Uzziya, Yotam, Ahaz and Hezekiah, the kings of Yehuda. That's more or less the idea of the Sefer, and I just want to point out to you some things that we're going to get into a little bit later, some yes, some no, but we have some fascinating archaeology that was found right here on top of what's known today as City of David, which was really where Yerushalayim was as it began under David and Shlomo HaMelech, but then it expanded to the west, which is the western area that you're seeing now, which sort of overlaps a lot of modern day Yerushalayim, or the old city of Yerushalayim, to the west. Now in this area, which if you walk outside of the Dung Gate, Sha'ar HaAshpot, and you take a left, and you keep on going towards Sha'ar HaRachamim, the Golden Gate, or Sha'ar Shushan, in the time of the second Beit HaMikdash, there is an excavation there you can look into, and in this special place were found several bula, which are clay impressions of a seal. In other words, there was a seal stamp, a chotam, a chotemet, which was impressed into a bula. In modern Hebrew, bul is stamp. Bula is a seal impression, so it's just to differentiate between the two. Now, this particular one is very important when introducing Sefer Yeshayahu, and I'm going to link an article about it in the description, because we found a bula which says on it, and hold your breath, listen carefully, it says, Le Yeshayahu Navi. Now, is this Yeshayahu Hanavi? Does it actually say that? It's fragmented, it's broken, it's missing an image on the top, and it says Yeshayah, probably Yeshayahu, and the words Nun, Bet, Yud, we're assuming that the continuation is Aleph. Now, I personally attended a presentation by Professor Christopher Rolston, who's one of the top 10 epigraphers, experts in analyzing ancient text in the world, And this was right after this discovery was made, and he said there are several reasons to doubt that this is absolutely Yeshayahu Hanavi. Some have to do with what are the alternative letters that could have been instead of the Aleph, and there are several variations, and others are the question of why would a prophet have a seal which is signed Isaiah the prophet? So there's a question about that. It's not 100% conclusive, but it's very fascinating to find it, and so I linked in the description to an article all about it. But this was found in the same context as this one, which is from Chizkiyahu HaMelech, the one on the left, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. That has to do with the winged sun disk and beetles and Egyptian symbols. We're going to get to that later. Speaking of the 4 kings of Yehuda who were in the time of Yeshayahu HaNavi, so these are 3 out of 4 of their names that have been found in archaeology, from right to left. In the Israel Museum is a stone from the Second Temple period. You can see that it has Second Temple period Hebrew known as Ktav Ashurit, and it's written in Aramaic, and it says, "To here were brought the bones of Uzziya, the king of Yehuda, do not open." Now, having a warning on a tombstone saying do not open is quite common. People would rob graves for their treasures and jewelry, and in this case they wanted to make sure nobody breaks in. Now the question is this an original? Is it a fake? There's a question about it. It's not exactly clear. It could be a forgery, but if it is an original, what we need to know is that it was, of course, a reconstruction or a renovation of the original grave of Uzziya Melech Yehuda. Now, next to Eilat, we found a seal which says Yotam. That's the image in the middle, and this is from the Da'at Mikra Atlas. Lots of fascinating maps that we're going to see later from that atlas, which I highly recommend, as well as lots of archaeology. It's a great resource. And this doesn't necessarily mean it's the Yotam, but it's from the Iron Age too. It's from Malchut Yehuda. It's cool. And finally, we have the seal which says on it, Lechizkiyahu Ahaz Melech Yehuda. So we actually have the name Ahaz included in here, but this is belonging to Chizkiah. So we have in archaeology all the 4 names of the kings in different finds. Whether it's them or not, it's really cool to see that. So this is the period of time in which Yeshayahu operates, and we know, of course, that there were 3 other Nevi'im, or as Chazal say, there were Arba'a Nevi'im shenitnabu beperek echad. We also have Micha, we have Hoshea and Amos. So hopefully when we get to Terei Asa, we'll be able to dedicate some more time to expand on some things that we've sort of seen in Melachim, and we're going to see again in Divrei Yamim, and we're seeing here, like Ashur, for example. We're going to get a lot to that, okay? So hang in on for that. So what we need to understand about Sefer Yeshayahu before we delve into some highlights is really what is going on. When we approach Sefer Yeshayahu, and in general Nevi'im Acharonim, there's a few things that we need to understand in order to realize what is really going on. And so I'd like here to give a brief introduction to what we mean when we say Nevi'im Acharonim. There's a famous Gemara in Baba Batra which discusses the 24 books of Tanach, who wrote them, etc., etc., and there's a lot of important conversation to have there. Now, Nevi'im Acharonim generally refers to Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who really are the last Nevi'im. It's probably a Mikreot Gedolot publication decision to call these Nevi'im from Yeshayahu upward Nevi'im Acharonim. Now Yeshayahu actually comes chronologically before Yirmiyahu and before Yechezkel, but there are Masorot, there are traditions which actually organize Yirmiyahu first, because we want to sort of continue the Churban, the destruction of the end of Melachim Bet, and then we can go into Yeshayahu, which ends with Nehama. So that's an interesting point to note. Now, Yeshayahu, as the beginning of what we're calling Nevi'im Acharonim today, is operating in the geopolitical sphere of the Age of Empires, which I described in depth in Melachim Bet, so go and watch that. And while we're mentioning it, if you didn't hit the like button on this and on that previous video, please go back and just hit that like button, because it's really going to help us. Now, if you think I'm not going to mention that again, think again. So, there's the kingdom of Assyria, of Ashur, and then there's Babylon, and of course then there's Persia. That's pretty much from Yeshayahu all the way till the end of Tanach. And in order to understand what Yeshayahu is talking about, we need to appreciate the geopolitical situation. But that's true for every situation when we're talking about kings and their decisions about alliances to make and so on. And we're going to see that this comes into play when we talk about comparing Yirmiyahu to Yeshayahu, because Yeshayahu, dealing with Sancherib and Assyria, says to the king, do not open the gates to Assyria. But Yirmiyahu says to the king Tzidkiyahu and Yechoniyahu and Yehoyakim, when facing Bavel and Nebuchadnezzar, open the gates to Bavel. So we really need to understand the geopolitics to appreciate what's going on and what are the challenges of all of the melachim and the decisions that they make and the impact that it had on them. But in addition, in general, and the reason I go into highlights is in order to understand the words of the Nevi'im, and especially Yeshayahu, who's very complex, very difficult words to understand. Sometimes you don't even understand, is he talking about the Geulah from Sancheriv or from Bavel or La'atid Lavo? We don't even know some of the time who the enemy is. So it's complicated. And so in order to understand what they're even talking about, we need to understand the world that the Nevi'im are living in, which has to do with warfare and agriculture and how business is done. There is so much to talk about, and I can only cover a few highlights, otherwise this is going to be another 40-minute video. So let's get into the structure. Very, very basically, Sefer Yeshayahu, according to Dat Mikra, can be divided into two main sections. Section 1 is dealing with the four kings which we mentioned, Uzziya, Yotam, Ahaz, Hezekiah, and their geopolitical neighborhood. And that has to do with other subcategories, which we're going to get into a little bit later, other nations to which Yeshayahu gives prophecies about. And the second part is Nehama, which we read a lot in the Sheva de Nechamuta and the following Haftarot after Tisha B'Av, leading into Rosh Hashanah. And in the first section, which is really the one we're going to focus on, there are subdivisions into the different dealings with the kings, like Perakim Lamed Vav Lamed Zayin sort of overlap with Melachim Bet, with the story of Chizkiyahu and Sancheriv, and on and on and on. The first thing we need to know about the geopolitical situation, which will help us really understand the Sefer, is the rise of Ashur, of Assyria, to power. The gradual expansion of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which at first sort of minded their own business and gradually subjugated and conquered many other nations in the region, is the background to all of the other nevuot which Yeshayahu has, talking about the pending doom of all of these other nations. And we're talking about Bavel, Peleshet, Moab, Damascus, Mitzrayim, Midbar Yam, Duma, Ba'arav, Tzor. We are talking about from Egypt all the way up to Lebanon, and then all the way down into the Arabian Peninsula. Many different nations which were indeed subjugated by the Assyrian Empire, and their doom is near. And there's, of course, a moral gloss to all of this. It's because I thought I'm so great, and this and that. We have that for several of the different nations and things that they did. But then it ends up with Bavel. There's Masa Bavel, but there's also the end of Bavel. Bavel Shem V'Sher V'Nin V'Nechet. We're going to talk about that a little bit later. The end of Bavel is also prophesied. And finally, we have a nevuah in which Koresh is called the chosen of God. He's the Mashiach Hashem. Hashem sends Koresh as some sort of redeemer. Now, when speaking of Koresh, this is where you have this contentious question in scholarship, which says, well, obviously, this had to have been written later because it's talking about something that happened later. But when you consider what Nevuah is, then yes, of course it was mentioned earlier. So generally speaking, this isn't really a problem. But just so you know, there are those people who talk about it, and there is so much more to talk about. As I'm speaking it out, I'm going like, oh my gosh, I forgot 30 different things. It is what it is. We're going to have to go into it. So let's go into our first highlight. So we are going to be talking about a Masa, which is called Masa Gei Chizayon. And this is sort of an overview of a few issues which have to do with the state of Yerushalayim, but specifically about the over-preparation, we can say, for the impending invasion of the Assyrian Empire. In other words, Chizkiyahu rebels against Sancheriv, and Sancheriv is about to invade, and he prepares. So a few things that go on in this Masa Gei Chizayon. Number one, I mentioned in the beginning, who dug their own grave but didn't get to get buried there? Well, there's this discussion about this person whose name is Shevna. Now, Shevna is one of the Sofrim, one of the ministers in the royal court. The Gemara in Sanhedrin talks about how he really was trying to lead a coup against Chizkiyahu and to get people to open the gates to Assyria. And there's a whole story about how there's a miracle that intervened and he ended up getting ripped limb to limb, but nothing really happened to Yerushalayim. So that's a fun story. But Shevna is one of several people who are there. There's also Eliakim and there's Yoach, who are there standing on the walls of Yerushalayim as Ravshake, who we'll mention later, approaches Yerushalayim to threaten and to taunt the people on the wall, to demoralize them and get them to open the gate. Now, Shevna thought a lot about himself, thought very highly about himself, and dug for himself a royal grave. And on that, in Masa Gei Chizayon, Yeshayahu says to him, who do you think you are digging a grave for yourself? You will not get to be buried in there. Your bones are going to be dragged to some other place. The British excavations in the land of Israel or in Palestine back in the day found this inscription, which is damaged, so it doesn't have all of the words, and it says this tomb belongs to something Yahu, Asher al Habayit, and that's Shivna Asher al Habayit. That's how he's mentioned. He is a person who's in charge of the house. He's a steward of some sort. That is his royal title, Asher al Habayit. And it says there are no treasures in gold here, just bones, and whoever opens this place should be cursed or something like that. In other words, he overprepared. He never even got to be buried there, according to the story in Tanach. So that's number one. But who else was overpreparing? Well, Chizkiyahu HaMelech was really nervous about the invasion of Sanherib, the king of Assyria, and so he did two things which are mentioned here in Masah Gechizayon. Number one, he took the Gichon spring and moved it into the city, dug underground. We mentioned that in Melachim Bet. There's great links in the description there, so go and watch that. And then there's, of course, the building of the broad wall, which he actually built by breaking some of the walls, running through the walls of houses in order to quickly, rapidly surround the western part of the city and fortify it. Now, I want to show you some really cool things from my neighborhood. Number one, the Chizkiyahu water cistern, which we know this is the redirection of the water channel into the city, which is mentioned here. But the second thing was a discovery which was done right after 1967, after the Jewish quarter was in ruins after the Six-Day War. This is a picture that I took this Friday for you guys right over here, so hit that like button. And this is what was discovered as they dug underneath my parents' home. They discovered the remains of this wall, Meir Ben-Dov of Hebrew University, and the way they identified this wall with the wall of Chizkiyahu from Yeshayahu's Gechizayon is several different things. One of them is, of course, the material remains that have to do with the battle and the warfare and so on. But also this image, which you can see if you're standing there by the wall, of a house which has the wall running through it. You broke the walls of the houses to make this fortified wall. So that's one of the things you can see there. Now, if you stand there, another thing you'll see is the estimated height of the wall, which has to do with certain calculations of base to height ratio, etc. And finally, if you look here, there's a map of today's old city, which is 500-year-old wall of Suleiman the Magnificent, which is in blue. But you have the dotted line, which is the walls from the time of Bayit Rishon, which we are now discussing. And right over here is that wall that we are standing on, what is known as the broad wall. So that is a bit over-preparing, and indeed Chazal say that there are several things that Chizkiyahu did that Chazal were not really, or Chazal, well, at the time they weren't called Chazal, but that Chachamim were not really happy with. And one of them is Satan Megichon. But the idea is he over-prepared, and you need to know that Hashem is going to take care of Yerushalayim, and Sanherib is not going to succeed. Have a little more bitachon. Moving on to our next Masah. And that is a very beautiful one, which has to do with Moab. The address or the Masah to Moab. Now, we've mentioned Moab before. In Melachim Bet, in the beginning, we got into the Moabite stone or the Mesha stela, and I want to mention that again, because when you read Masah Moab, it mentions so many names of different cities, which you will recognize if you know the geography, but if you read the stela, some of these names are mentioned. In other words, this Masah Moab actually describes the geography of the many different cities. Kir, Ar, Dibon, Nebo, Medba, Cheshbon, El Ale, Yahatz, Meidimon, Nachal Arnon, all of these locations. In order to understand what he's even saying, you need to be rooted on the map. And that's why I keep on showing you the map again and again and again. This is the Tanach website map, but there's more and more different kinds of maps. It's really crucial to see this. Now, speaking of maps, I want to introduce you to a very important map, even though it's 5th century, and that is the Medba map. The Medba map, which I've actually stood at in the Church of St. George in Jordan. And this map is basically a miniature model, so to speak, on a mosaic of the Holy Land. Now, where does the expression the Holy Land come from? From the Byzantine Empire, from when the Roman Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, became Christian, and because of that, Jerusalem suddenly became important, and the land of Israel, known then as Sura Palestina, became important. It then became the Holy Land, and with the funding of an empire, many churches were built to host the many, many pilgrims who came to the Holy Land. So this is sort of like a mini Israel before you go into Israel, and this is a key archaeological discovery when discussing the study of the names of and the identification of ancient cities in the land of Israel, because it's one of the earliest maps that we actually have. And in the center of it, you can see right over here, is the old city of Jerusalem. Now, in the Cardo, which is the Byzantine heart street of the Jewish quarter, which you can see in this image on the Medba map as a long line, a long horizontal line. Cardo from the word cardiology, heart, right? It's the heart of the city. This is actually in the Cardo. There's a replica of it in the Cardo, which I grew up with before ever knowing what the Medba map was. And you can actually see it today. It's under Yehudim Street in the Old City. So that is Masa Moav. Next. This is a really exciting one. This is Masa Mitzrayim. This is a special address to the land of Egypt. Now, there's a lot of beautiful things that you can talk about here, but the first thing I want to talk about is what's the buzz with the bees. And so I'm not talking about the birds and the bees, I'm just talking about the bees. Now, here we actually have Egypt referred to as a fly, and Assyria referred to as a bee. And I thought I would just use this opportunity to just share with you a fun highlight. And don't take this too seriously, because as you noticed, Assyria is the bee and Egypt is the fly. But Egypt is actually compared to a bee, and that has to do with the history of ancient Egypt. And they actually looked at the bee as some sort of sacred animal. I mean, they even used the honey. And that is a reference to Lower Egypt. So a note on Egypt is that Egypt is divided into two geographical areas and two administrative districts known as Upper Egypt, which is further south, but it's topographically higher up. The water of the Nile comes flowing down into the Nile Delta, and that's called Lower Egypt. And since these are two administrative districts, they actually had different iconography, different images, and different sorts of crowns that the pharaohs would wear depending on where their origin is from, and so on. So you can see the crown of Lower Egypt to the left, and then moving to the right, the crown of Upper Egypt. Then there's the double crown of Upper and Lower, and then there's the sedge and the bee. The sedge is Upper Egypt, and the bee is Lower Egypt. So the bee is the symbol of Lower Egypt. I just thought that would be a fun thing to mention, but let's get rid of, there's also vultures here, so let's just get rid of the birds and the bees and move on to some serious business. And that is Assyria. Now we know that Assyria ends up invading Egypt. Esarhaddon, the son of Sennacherib, invades Egypt. After failing once, he makes a second attempt and succeeds, repelling Terhaka Melech Kush. We mentioned the Kushite dynasty, the Nubians who actually took control of Egypt because Egypt was weak. And so if you look at the Nivwa, it says, "V'sichsachti Mitzrayim b'Mitzrayim," Egypt will be fighting themselves. Yes, there's a lot going on in Egypt. There's a lot of instability, which other people are taking advantage of. And then Ashurbanipal invades Egypt, who's the son of Esarhaddon, the grandson of Sancherib, and I'm holding a mug from the British Museum's exhibit, "I am Ashurbanipal, King of the Universe, King of the World." It's a great exhibition. I'll link something about it in the description, but Ashurbanipal was the last mighty king of Assyria, and he invades Egypt. So then you read about there's a Mesilah ha'olam mitzrayim Ashur. There's going to be a direct connection between Egypt and Assyria, indeed. And at this point on, Egypt is done. Egypt is invaded then by the Babylonians, then by the Persians, then by the Greeks, then by the Romans. Egypt is no longer at its heyday after the invasion of Esarhaddon. So this is really the impact of the Assyrian Empire growing. Now, on this note, there's another part of the Nevuah that says there's going to be on that day a Mizbeach in Eretz Mitzrayim, a Mizbeach to Hashem in Eretz Mitzrayim, and there are those who say, in Chazal and in scholarship, that that Mizbeach is actually referring to the temple of the Jews of Elephantine, or to the Mizbeach of Chonio. There's a Mikdash Chonio of Onias from the second temple. There was a Jewish community in Egypt. So here's where I'd like to introduce you to a really, really exciting and cool discovery in the island of Elephantine and the very south of Egypt, or Upper Egypt, on the border of Nubia by Aswan, where the dam was built in the 1960s, the Aswan Dam. And that is the Jews of Elephantine and the Elephantine Papyri, which is plural of papyrus. Now, the papyrus is a reed-based paper invented in Egypt. It's actually the source of the word paper. And on this ink letter on papyrus, which many of them have been found in Egypt, is actually a letter of the Jewish community from the Persian period. Now, there was a Jewish garrison there from the time of, like, we could say the 7th century BC, so that's 2,600 years ago. In other words, more or less from the time of Menashe, who indeed we have mentioned in the names of Ashurbanipal's writings. We have Menashe mentioned in Ashurbanipal's writing. Menashe is mentioned also in the writings of Esarhaddon. There was a garrison which was forced down into Egypt. There was a Jewish colony in Elephantine, in an island in southern Egypt. Isn't that cool? And that community lived on for hundreds of years. And in the time of the Persian period, in the time of the Second Temple, they were corresponding with the Jewish community in Jerusalem to ask how to keep the Pesach and how to do this and how do we hold on to our Judaism? We're so far away. What can we do? And indeed, there was royal decree by the Persian Empire to enable them to keep Pesach, even though they're on guard duty, with all of what goes with that. And so this is one of many. They've been excavated by the Brooklyn Museum, so you can actually go to the Brooklyn Museum. There's one of them hanging up there in the Egyptian galleries, but you can look them up online. They're known as the Elephantine Papyri. I will put a link in the description. And if I can just read you the first 4 words of this Elephantine Papyri in Aramaic, it says like this: Yerach Tchot Shnat Arba Le'Artachshast. The month of Thoth, this is Thoth or Tchot, the Egyptian god of wisdom. That's just the Egyptian calendar. Year 4 of Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes was mentioned in Ezra and Nehemiah. We are talking about a Persian king mentioned in Tanach, and this is a Jewish document. I had to mention this, and I actually did a nice video on this for the Chidona Tanach, specifically about the Jews in the Persian period, so I'm going to link to that in the description as well, and give that video a like. Moving on, leaving Egypt, we are almost done. Babylon, Masa Bavel. Now here I'm actually going to be very brief because we're going to have a lot to talk about Babylon in Yirmiyahu and a little bit more in Yechezkel, and we already mentioned a whole bunch in Melachim Bet. This is the Ishtar Gate of Nebuchadnezzar. When you come in from the north into Bavel, this is the first thing you see. It's the procession way with 120 glazed brick lions, which I mentioned, and this was entirely destroyed. Babylon was destroyed by Persia, and eventually, even though it was the center of operations for Cyrus the Great, eventually Bavel was destroyed. And that's what the Navi says. V'ichrati leBavel Shem v'She'er v'Nin v'Neched. You will be completely obliterated and done. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is Babylon today. This is the mighty Bavel, which Nebuchadnezzar thought, ha ha ha, I am the king of the world. Look at this beautiful and glorious Babylon. Just wait till we get to Sefer Daniel. I can't wait. That's really how my career started, which teaching Sefer Daniel and about Babylon. Now, in the background, you can see the palace of Saddam Hussein, and Saddam Hussein actually saw himself as a neo-Nebuchadnezzar. He minted coins with images of Nebuchadnezzar and rebuilt a copy of the Ishtar Gate in Iraq, even though there is the original in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin. That's all I'm going to say about Bavel now, but hang in for Sefer Yeshayahu because there's going to be tons of juicy stuff. Last but not least, I just have to mention, while I mentioned a lot of the glazed brick lions, this is the lion from the throne room of Nebuchadnezzar Melech Bavel, excavated by a Canadian expedition. So this is in the ROM, in the Royal Ontario Museum. I was there in 2015, and it's sitting there in an inconspicuous corner. Nobody notices it because it's just so Canadian and polite that they don't say anything about it, but it's actually important. This is not one of the 120 lions. This is the lion from the throne room of Nebuchadnezzar. If you want to envision what Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah saw when they were facing Nebuchadnezzar, this is it. I got shivers when I stood here. Now, this time for real, last but not least, the big story of Chizkiyahu and Sancheriv, the most documented story in biblical archaeology, as we mentioned, in length. There's so much to talk about. This is an image from the Assyrian Gallery in the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is my favorite museum in the world. The Israel Museum is second, okay? But I love the Israel Museum too. Now, these two standing winged lions and bulls called Lamassu are going to be important for us in the end, so hang in there. Now, we've mentioned, of course, that there's the Battle of Lachish and the Lachish reliefs in Nineveh and in the British Museum and the Sancheriv Prism, the Taylor Prism, and the Rassam Prism, which talk about the story. We've mentioned that you can actually go to Lachish and see the siege ramp and all of that stuff. And, of course, there's the image of Sancheriv sitting on his throne surveying the spoils of Lachish. All of this we've mentioned. I can talk about it for hours, but we've done that already. Let's move on to some juicy highlights. And that has to do with Ravshake. Ravshake is a high-ranking officer appointed by Sancheriv to go to Yerushalayim, even though Sancheriv never made it to Yerushalayim. He was busy with Lachish, down in the south. And he goes to the wall, and he taunts the people on the wall, and he speaks to them in Hebrew, saying, who is this Chizkiyahu and this God of Israel who you think you can count on? That never helped anybody else, and you're going to really, really pay for this if you don't open the gates. And he's talking, of course, to Shevna and Eliakim and Yoach, and they, the messengers, the dignitaries, say to Ravshake, speak to us in Aramaic. That's the lingua franca, that's the administrative language. Why is that the administrative language? Parentheses. Because the Assyrian Empire under Tiglath-Pileser III, which you mentioned in Melachim Bet, exiled Retzin and destroyed the kingdom of Aram and absorbed the administration of the Arameans into their infrastructure, into their empire, and so Aramaic became the second official language of the Assyrian Empire and the world empires to follow for hundreds of years. That was parenthetical. The word Ravshake means Sar HaMashkim, and there's an image of a eunuch here. This is from the same room you're looking at in the Met, but this is from Asher Natsir Pal. This is from the time of Eliyahu Navi. It's earlier, and you see a servant with a fly wisp keeping the flies out of the wine held by the king Asher Natsir Pal. But anyway, just wine, and I thought that's a nice anchor. Ravshake means the Sar HaMashkim, Ravshake. But it's actually a very high position because you are like the right-hand man of the king. You're the most trusted. You're trusted with his drink. It doesn't just mean you're a person who tastes the wine, because you think about the story of Yosef and the two ministers, Sar HaMashkim and Sar HaOfim. Sar HaMashkim is a very big deal. The king's life is in your hand. It's a very high position. And so Ravshake is sent, and the reason I'm mentioning Ravshake, not only because of this fun tidbit, but also because of the psychological warfare which he employs. Because when the ministers say to him, why are you speaking to us in Hebrew? They say, oh, we're not talking to you. We're talking to the people. This is psychological warfare. We want everybody to hear the message and to shiver in their pants. And he says some really not nice things there. This was the clean version. But eventually he says, if you open the gates, I'm going to take you to a better land and things are going to be good for you. So there's actually some zechut that is given to Ravshake for that. But anyway, I just want to mention psychological warfare, and this is a relief from the British Museum, one of the reliefs of Tiglath-Pileser. You see that there is a battle tank, you see archers, you see Assyrians climbing up to the roofs of the defenses, and finally, if you look carefully to the center on the right, on top of the tank, you see impaled prisoners, impaled people. This is psychological warfare. We are coming to dishearten you and make you weak, so that we can crumble your defenses from inside and from the outside. This is Assyrian war tactics. Now that I've mentioned that, let's get into some other really, really cool stuff, and that has to do with Beetlejuice. So Chizkiyahu HaMelech prepares for the Assyrian invasion, as we mentioned in Melachim Bet, by tightening up the administration, collecting taxes, and these taxes are collected in these jugs that have these Lamelech jug handles on the right, which has a winged beetle on it, a clear Egyptian symbol, and it says on it, Lamelech Chevron. Now, we've mentioned this in Melachim Bet. There's information in the description. I'll try to put some more here, too. What is a winged beetle doing on Chizkiyahu's seal? In addition to that, we also have his personal stamp, at least the impression of his stamp, the bula, which says, L'Chizkiyahu Ahaz Melech Yehuda, Chizkiyahu son of Ahaz, king of Yehuda. And look at it. It has a winged sun disk, and it has the Ankh. These are clear Egyptian symbols related to idolatry. Look. The winged sun disk, which also shows up with Ahura Mazda and with Ashur and with other gods in the ancient Near East. The winged sun disk is very prominent. And then we have the Ankh, that symbol of life, which looks like a cross with a loop on the top. And I deliberately chose this funky, artsy one because it also shows you the eye of Ra, the winged sun disk, and all those serpents, as well as the winged beetle. So you get all the symbols together. What is this doing on Chizkiyahu HaMelech's personal seal? Ladies and gentlemen, two things. Number one, we mentioned that Chizkiyahu had an alliance with Egypt, and Egypt was controlled by the Nubians, story for another time, so he had Egyptian symbols. But in addition to that, the winged sun disk actually shows up in the Navi as V'zarachti alechem ir'eshmi shemesh tzedakah u'marpeh bichnafea. Hashem heals the tzaddikim like the sun with its wings. The winged sun is a symbol of health. And therefore archaeologists, and we're talking about Elat Mazal and so on, are suggesting that this is a special seal which Chizkiyahu made after his miraculous refu'ah. He healed from his deathly illness. And so he comes to say, I am healthy. And that Ankh means health. Ankh means health. It's the symbol of health. And that is why he has these images which have to do with health. And the connection to Egypt is also with that influence of the connection to Egypt geopolitically, but also it's kind of like Nike. You just do it. It doesn't really have any deep meaning at the time. Now that's really an overview. I just want to wrap up by saying that according to Ashurbanipal, remember this guy? Ashurbanipal, his grandfather was killed when he was bowing down and praying between the two lamasu, like in this image. So when I bring kids to this place, we sort of act that out. If they can do that maturely in the museum, raises a lot of eyebrows, but hey, the museum needs to come to life, doesn't it? And that's what I do, and that's why I'm here. So, wrapping up Sefer Yeshayahu, I think that today, more than ever, we can see the second part, the Nevuot and the Nechamot, coming true. We are living in historic, unprecedented times, where if you just read the words of the Nevi'im, you suddenly realize we are living in a prophecy which has come true. These are incredible times to live in. And so I hope we can appreciate that by starting to study the Nevi'im a lot more, not only from the archaeological perspective, but just to see the world that we are living in, which is really incredible. It's amazing things from the Nevi'im coming true. And on that note, I want to say thank you very much for watching. It's been a pleasure so far. Please like, subscribe, follow, and of course, hitting that like button is something you should always do on YouTube videos. That's all we have for today. I'm Nachliel Selavan. This is Archaeology Snapshot, Sefer Study, and I'll see you in the next one in Sefer Yirmiyahu.